Margaret Chen stepped out of her black luxury car and looked up at the old brick building. The sign read, Riverside Children's Home, in faded blue letters. She checked her expensive watch and sighed. Another charity visit. Another box to check. Off her list. She had been doing this for 5 years now. Every 3 months, her assistant would schedule a visit to some charity. Margaret would show up, smile for photos, write a big check, and leave. It was good for business. It made her company look caring, but Margaret never really cared herself. The morning had started badly. Her biggest client was threatening to leave. The stock price was down. Her board members were asking too many questions. Margaret just wanted to get this visit over with and get back to real work. A woman in her 50s opened the front door. She had kind eyes and gray hair pulled back in a simple bun. Ms. Chen, I'm Linda Rodriguez, the director here. Thank you so much for coming. Margaret forced a smile and shook her hand. Of course. Happy to help. Linda led her through the hallway. The walls were painted bright yellow, but the paint was old and chipped in places. Children's artwork hung everywhere. Stick figures holding hands, rainbows made with finger paints, hearts cut out of red paper. We house about 40 children here, Linda explained as they walked. Ages 5 to 17. Most are waiting for families to adopt them. Margaret nodded politely, but wasn't really listening. She was thinking about the presentation she had to give tomorrow, the quarterly reports that needed reviewing, the emails piling up in her inbox. They passed a common room where children were watching cartoons on an old television. A few looked up at Margaret with curious eyes. She gave them a small wave and kept walking. This is our library, Linda said, opening another door. Shelves lined the walls filled with worn books. A few kids sat at small tables reading quietly. And over here is our computer room. The kids love it when volunteers teach them coding. Margaret glanced inside. The computers looked like they were from 10 years ago. She made a mental note to donate some new ones. It would be good publicity. They continued the tour. Linda showed her the dining hall, the bedrooms, the playground outside. Everything was clean but old. Everything needed updating. Margaret's fingers itched to check her phone, but she knew it would look bad. And this is our music room, Linda said, pushing open a wooden door. The room was small and cozy. Sunlight streamed through tall windows. There were a few chairs arranged, in a circle. Some music stands in the corner, and in the center of the room sat an old piano. But what caught Margaret's attention wasn't the piano. It was the girl sitting next to it. She looked about 12 years old. Dark hair fell in waves around her shoulders. She wore a simple purple sweater and jeans with small holes in the knees. But it was her eyes that made Margaret stop walking. They were the saddest eyes she had ever seen. The girl wasn't looking at them. She was staring at the piano keys like they held some secret. Her small hand reached out and touched one key gently. It made a soft, lonely sound. That's Sophia, Linda said quietly. She's been with us for 3 years now. Margaret found herself walking closer. Something about this girl was different from the others. She seemed lost in her own world. Does she play? Margaret asked. Linda's face grew sad. We think so. Her grandmother taught her before she passed away. But Sophia doesn't talk much anymore, especially not to strangers. Margaret looked at the old piano. Half the keys were yellowed with age. It was probably out of tune. But the girl kept touching the keys like they were precious. She sits here every day, Linda continued. Sometimes I hear her humming, but she's never actually played while anyone was watching. Margaret felt something strange in her chest. She had built her whole life around being practical, logical, unemotional. But looking at this girl made her feel something she couldn't name. Has anyone tried to adopt her? Margaret asked. Linda shook her head. A few families have shown interest, but Sophia gets very quiet around new people. She won't speak at all. Most families want children who will bond with them quickly. Margaret understood. She had been the same way as a child. After her parents died, she had lived with her aunt who didn't really want her. Margaret had learned early that staying quiet and out of the way was safer than hoping for love. The girl touched another piano key. This time she pressed it a little harder. The sound echoed in the quiet room. "She's waiting for something," Margaret said, surprising herself by speaking out. Loud. "What do you mean?" Linda asked. Margaret wasn't sure what she meant. But looking at Sophia, she could see it. The way the girl held herself. The way she looked at the piano. She was waiting for permission. Or maybe for someone to ask her to play. Without thinking, Margaret walked over to the piano bench. Sophia looked up at her with those enormous dark eyes. For a moment, they just looked at each other. "Hi," Margaret said softly. "I'm Margaret." Sophia didn't answer, but she didn't look away either. Margaret sat down on the other end of the piano bench, leaving space between them. "That's a beautiful piano," she said. Sophia's eyes flicked to the keys and back to Margaret's face. She still didn't speak. Margaret had no idea what to say to a 12-year-old girl. She barely knew how to talk to the adults in her life. But something about Sophia's quiet sadness made her want to try. "I used to play piano when I was little," Margaret said. It was true, though she hadn't thought about it in years. "My teacher was very strict. She made me practice scales for hours." Sophia tilted her head slightly, the first sign of interest she had shown. "I wasn't very good," Margaret continued, "but I loved the way it sounded when someone else played. Really played, you know? With feeling." Sophia's hand moved to rest on the piano keys again. She pressed one key so gently it barely made a sound. Margaret felt that strange feeling in her chest again. Before she could stop herself, she heard her own voice, saying something impossible. "If you can play this piano," Margaret said with a smile, "I'll adopt you myself." She meant it as a joke, a way to make the girl smile. Margaret Chen didn't adopt children. She barely had time for a pet. She lived alone in a glass penthouse and worked 16 hours a day. The idea of her as a mother was ridiculous. But Sophia's head snapped up. Her eyes went wide. For the first time since Margaret had walked into the room, the girl looked truly alive. Linda gasped softly behind them. "Miss Chen, I don't think—" But Sophia was already moving. She turned on the bench to face the piano properly. Her back straightened. Her hands moved to hover over the keys. Margaret realized with a sinking feeling that she might have just made the biggest mistake of her life. Or maybe, she thought as Sophia's fingers found their first position, she was about to discover something she never knew she was missing. Sophia's hands trembled above the piano keys. Margaret held her breath, suddenly realizing what she had done. She had made a promise to a child, a promise she never intended to keep. But looking at Sophia's face, she saw something that made her stomach flip. Hope, real, pure hope, shining in those dark eyes. Linda stepped closer, her voice worried. "Sophia, honey, you don't have to—" But Sophia wasn't listening to anyone else. Her eyes were locked on Margaret's face, searching for something. Trust, maybe, or just the smallest sign that this stranger meant what she said. Margaret wanted to take it back, to explain that she was just being kind, that she didn't really mean it. But the words stuck in her throat. How do you crush a child's hope when it's the first time you've seen her truly alive? Sophia's right hand moved first. One finger pressed down on middle C. The note rang out clear and strong, much better than Margaret expected from such an old piano. Sophia held the note for a long moment, as if testing whether the instrument would hold up her dreams. Then her left hand joined in. A simple chord. Then another. The beginning of something beautiful. Margaret recognized the piece immediately. Chopin's Minute Waltz. She had heard it played by professionals in concert halls that cost more per seat than most people made in a week. But she had never heard it played like this. Sophia's small fingers moved across the keys with impossible grace. Each note was perfect, precise, but filled with so much emotion that Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. This wasn't just playing. This was storytelling. This was a 12-year-old girl pouring her entire heart out through music. The melody danced and swirled through the small room. Fast sections that sparkled like sunlight on water. Soft parts that whispered of loneliness and longing. Sophia's eyes were closed now, lost in the music. Her whole body swayed with the rhythm. Margaret found herself leaning forward, completely captivated. She had forgotten about her meetings, her emails, her quarterly reports. Nothing existed except this moment, this music, this girl who was painting, pictures with sound. Other children had gathered in the doorway. They stood quietly, not wanting to break the spell. Even the youngest ones seemed to understand they were witnessing something special. Linda had tears streaming down her face. The music grew faster, more complex. Sophia's hands flew across the keys in patterns that seemed impossible for someone so young. But every note was exactly where it should be. Every phrase sang with perfect clarity. Margaret realized she was holding her breath. The music was building to something. Sophia's face was intense with concentration, but also peaceful in a way Margaret had never seen before. This was where Sophia belonged. At this piano, in this music. The final section arrived like a whirlwind. Sophia's hands danced across the entire keyboard, the melody spinning and jumping and soaring. The old piano sang like it was brand new, like it had been waiting years for the right person to wake it up, and then with one final perfect chord it was over. The silence that followed was complete. No one moved. No one breathed. The last notes seemed to hang in the air like magic. Sophia opened her eyes and looked directly at Margaret. For the first time since they met, she spoke. "I've been practicing for 3 years," she said quietly. Waiting for someone to ask, Margaret felt like the world had tilted sideways. 3 years. This girl had been practicing for 3 years, hoping someone would care enough to listen, hoping someone would want her enough to ask her to play. "How did you—" Margaret started, then stopped. Her voice came out rough with emotion. "My grandmother taught me," Sophia said, her voice still soft but clear. "Before she died, she made me promise to keep playing. She said music was the only thing that could never be taken away from me." Margaret understood now why Sophia had been so quiet, why she didn't talk to strangers. She had been protecting the most precious thing she had left, her music, her connection to the grandmother who had loved her. That was— Margaret struggled for words. "That was the most beautiful thing I've ever heard." Sophia's face lit up with the first real smile Margaret had seen from her. "Really?" "Really," Margaret said, and meant it completely. Linda wiped her eyes and stepped forward. "Sophia, I had no idea you could play like that. Why didn't you ever tell us?" Sophia looked down at the keys. "Nobody ever asked me to play before, and I wanted to save it for someone special." Margaret felt something crack open inside her chest. This girl had saved her best, most beautiful gift for 3 years, waiting for someone who would appreciate it, someone who would see her worth. "You kept your grandmother's promise," Margaret said gently. Sophia nodded. "She said that someday the right person would hear me play and know I belonged with them." Margaret's throat tightened. She had walked into this place thinking about business deals and photo opportunities. She had never expected to find herself sitting next to a girl who played like an angel and spoke like she held ancient wisdom. "Sophia," Margaret said carefully, "when I said what I said before, about adopting you." Sophia's face went very still. The hope in her eyes flickered like a candle in the wind. Margaret realized she was at a crossroads. She could take it back. Explain it was just a figure of speech. Go back to her safe, controlled, empty life. Or she could step into something completely unknown and terrifying. "I meant it," she heard herself say. "If you want that. If you think you might want to try being part of a family with me." Sophia stared at her for a long moment. Then she did something that broke Margaret's heart and put it back together at the same time. She reached out and took Margaret's hand. "I would like that," Sophia said simply. "I would like that very much." Margaret squeezed the small hand in hers. "I have to warn you. I don't know anything about being a mom. I work too much. I live in a place that's not very kid-friendly. I've never even had a pet." Sophia smiled, and this time it reached her eyes. "I don't know anything about having a mom either, but I could teach you piano if you want." Margaret laughed, surprising herself. When was the last time she had laughed like that? I would love that. Linda cleared her throat gently. Ms. Chen, adoption is a long process. There are home studies, background checks, court hearings. Margaret nodded, her practical side kicking back in. I understand. How long does it usually take? 6 months to a year typically. Sometimes longer. Margaret looked at Sophia, who was still holding her hand. Would you be okay with that? With waiting while we go through all the paperwork? Sophia squeezed her hand. I've been waiting my whole life for a family. I can wait a little longer. Margaret felt tears threaten again. This brave, talented, patient girl was willing to wait for her, a woman who hadn't even known she wanted a family until 5 minutes ago. Then let's do this, Margaret said. Let's figure out how to become a family. Sophia smiled and turned back to the piano. Want to hear another song? Margaret settled back, on the bench. I want to hear everything. 3 weeks later, Margaret sat in a small government office staring at a stack of papers that seemed to grow taller every time she looked away. The social worker across from her, Ms. Patricia Williams, had kind eyes but a serious expression that made Margaret's stomach twist with worry. Ms. Chen, I have to ask some difficult questions, Patricia said, clicking her pen. Adoption isn't like a business transaction. A child isn't something you can return if it doesn't work out. Margaret shifted in her uncomfortable plastic chair. She had been to 5 meetings like this already. Each one made her feel less prepared and more terrified. I understand that. Do you? Patricia leaned forward. Because your lifestyle concerns me. You work 60-hour weeks. You travel for business twice a month. You live on the 40th floor of a building with no other children. Where exactly does Sophia fit into this picture? The questions hit Margaret like punches. She had been asking herself the same things every night when she couldn't sleep. Her penthouse apartment was all glass and sharp corners. Her refrigerator contained mostly takeout containers and energy drinks. She owned exactly 0 child-friendly anything. I'm willing to make changes, Margaret said, hoping she sounded more confident than she felt. Patricia made a note on her paper. What kind of changes? Margaret had actually thought about this. I can work from home more often. I can hire a nanny for when I do have to travel. I can child-proof the apartment. And what about emotional support? Sophia has been through significant trauma. She'll need someone who can be present for her feelings, not just her physical needs. Margaret's mouth went dry. Emotions were not her strong suit. She had built her entire career on being logical and controlled. The last time she had cried was probably 10 years ago when her company almost went bankrupt. I'm learning, Margaret said quietly. Sophia is teaching me. It was true. In the 3 weeks since they met, Margaret had visited Sophia 6 times. Each visit was like stepping into a different world. Sophia would show her drawings she had made. They would sit together while Sophia played piano. Sometimes they just talked, about small things like favorite colors or what clouds looked like. Margaret had never realized how much she had missed just talking to another person without an agenda. Tell me about your own childhood, Patricia said, switching tactics. Margaret's chest tightened. She hated talking about this. My parents died in a plane crash when I was 8. I lived with my aunt until I was 18. And how was that experience? Margaret chose her words carefully. My aunt did her best. She fed me and clothed me and made sure I went to school, but she never really wanted children. She made that clear every day. Patricia's expression softened slightly. Is that why you want to adopt Sophia? Because you understand what it's like to be unwanted? The question caught Margaret off guard. She had been telling herself that she wanted to help Sophia because the girl was talented and deserving. But sitting in this sterile office, she had to face the real truth. Maybe, Margaret admitted, but it's more than that now. Sophia makes me remember what it feels like to hope for something. What do you hope for? Margaret thought about Sophia's smile when she played piano. The way the girl's whole face lit up when Margaret walked into the room, the feeling of Sophia's small hand in hers. I hope I can make her happy, Margaret said. I hope I can be the kind of person she deserves. Patricia made another note. Ms. Chen, I have to tell you that your application is being challenged. Margaret's blood turned cold. What do you mean? Your former business partner, David Kim, has filed a formal objection to your adoption petition. He claims you're emotionally unstable and unfit to be a parent. Margaret felt like she had been slapped. David, the man she had trusted with half her company until he tried to steal it all. The man who had forced her into a 2-year legal battle that had cost her millions and nearly destroyed her business. That's ridiculous, Margaret said, her voice rising. David is bitter because I won our lawsuit. He's trying to hurt me any way he can. He's provided documentation that suggests you have anger management issues, incidents where you shouted at employees, times when you made irrational business decisions based on emotion rather than logic. Margaret wanted to scream that every example David had given was from the period when he was actively sabotaging her company, when she was fighting for her life's work while discovering that her best friend was betraying her. Of course she had been emotional then. Miss Chen, I need you to stay calm, Patricia said gently. Margaret realized her hands were clenched into fists. She forced herself to breathe slowly. What does this mean for Sophia? It means the process will take longer. We'll need character, references, psychological evaluations, a more thorough investigation into your background. Margaret felt the walls closing in. How much longer? Could be another 6 months, maybe more. Margaret thought about Sophia waiting at the children's home. Sophia who asked every time Margaret visited when she could come home. Sophia who had been disappointed by adults so many times already. There's something else, Patricia continued. Sophia has been asking questions. She wants to know why the process is taking so long. Linda thinks she's starting to believe you might change your mind. The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. She thinks I'm going to abandon her. Children who have been in the system learn to protect themselves. They stop believing in promises when those promises take too long to come true. Margaret stood up abruptly. I need to see her. I need to explain. Ms. Chen, sit down. Patricia's voice was firm but not unkind. Running off to see Sophia in an emotional state will only make things worse. This is exactly the kind of impulsive behavior that concerns us. Margaret sat back down, but her leg bounced with nervous energy. So what am I supposed to do? Just wait while Sophia thinks I don't want her anymore? You're supposed to prove that. You can handle difficult situations calmly and maturely. Show us that when things get hard you don't run away or lash out. Margaret stared at the stack of papers on Patricia's desk. Each form represented another hoop to jump through, another test to pass, another way she could fail Sophia. Can I ask you something? Margaret said. Patricia nodded. Do you think I'd be a good mother? Patricia was quiet for a long moment. I think you care about Sophia. That's obvious. But caring isn't enough. Being a parent means putting someone else's needs before your own every single day. It means being patient when you're tired, being calm when you're stressed, being strong when you're scared. Margaret thought about her life before Sophia. She had been successful but empty, respected but alone. She had everything she thought she wanted and nothing she actually needed. What if I'm not good at it? Margaret asked quietly. No parent is good at it in the beginning, Patricia said with the first smile Margaret had seen from her. But good parents keep trying. They learn from their mistakes. They ask for help when they need it. Margaret looked out the window at the gray October sky. Somewhere across town, Sophia was probably sitting at that old piano, wondering if Margaret was just another adult who made promises she couldn't keep. I want to keep trying, Margaret said firmly. Whatever it takes. However long it takes. I want to be Sophia's mother. Patricia made one final note on her papers. Then prove it. Show us that you can handle pressure without falling apart. Show us that Sophia's well-being matters more than your pride or your convenience. Margaret stood up, feeling more determined than she had in weeks. What's the next step? Home study next week. We'll need to see where Sophia would be living and evaluate whether it's appropriate for a child. Margaret thought about her sterile penthouse with its sharp edges and expensive art. I'll make some changes. Good, Patricia said. And Ms. Chen? Sophia is lucky to have someone fighting for her. Don't give up. Margaret walked out of the office into the cool autumn air. She had work to do. Margaret stood in her living room surrounded by boxes and furniture covers, watching two workers carefully move her glass coffee table into storage. Her penthouse looked like a tornado had hit it. Everything sharp, breakable, or expensive was being packed away. "Ma'am, are you sure about the white couch?" asked one of the movers. "It's Italian leather, worth more than my car." Margaret looked at the pristine white sofa where she had spent countless evenings working on her laptop. She imagined Sophia sitting there with art supplies or snacks. White leather and 12-year-olds didn't mix. "Box it up," she said firmly. "Everything goes." Her phone rang for the 20th time that morning. Her assistant's voice was frantic. "Margaret, the board meeting got moved to tomorrow. The investors from Tokyo are flying in early, and the Mitchell contract needs your signature by noon, or we lose the deal." Margaret watched the workers carry out her expensive dining table. She had eaten maybe 10 meals at that table in 5 years. Always alone, always working. "Reschedule the board meeting," Margaret said. "Tell the investors I'll meet them next week, and get someone else to handle the Mitchell contract." "But Margaret, you always handle the big contracts yourself. The board won't understand." "Then tell them I'm becoming a mother," Margaret said, surprising herself with how good it felt to say. "Tell them my priorities have changed." She hung up and immediately called Linda at the children's home. "How is Sophia today?" Linda's voice was worried. "Not good, Margaret. She's been asking when you're coming to get her. I told her these things take time, but she's starting to withdraw again. She hasn't played piano in 3 days." Margaret's heart sank. She had been so busy preparing for the home study that she hadn't visited Sophia in a week, the longest gap since they met. "I'm coming over," Margaret said. "Margaret, wait. There's something you should know." Sophia overheard a phone conversation yesterday. One of our newer staff members was talking to her boyfriend about your situation. She mentioned that some adoptions fall through, that sometimes adults change their minds. Margaret felt sick. "What did Sophia say?" "Nothing. But she hasn't spoken much since then. And this morning I found her in the music room just staring at the piano. Not playing, just sitting there." Margaret was already grabbing her car keys. "I'll be there in 20 minutes. The drive to Riverside felt like the longest of Margaret's life. She kept thinking about Sophia's face the first day they met. Those sad, hopeful eyes. The way Sophia had saved her music for 3 years, waiting for someone who would truly want her. When Margaret walked into the children's home, Linda met her at the door with a worried expression. "She's in the music room," Linda said quietly. "But Margaret, she might not want to talk. She's protecting herself." Margaret found Sophia exactly where Linda had described, sitting on the piano bench, staring at the keys like they had betrayed her. She looked smaller than Margaret remembered, more fragile. "Hi, sweetheart," Margaret said softly from the doorway. Sophia looked up briefly, then back at the piano. "Hi." Margaret sat down beside her on the bench, the same spot where everything had started. "I heard you haven't been playing," Sophia shrugged. "Don't feel like it." Margaret felt her chest tighten. This was her fault. She had gotten so caught up in paperwork and home studies that she had forgotten the most important thing. Sophia needed to know she mattered. "I'm sorry I haven't been here," Margaret said. "I've been making changes to my apartment so it would be ready for you." Sophia's eyes flicked toward her for just a moment. "Changes? Big changes. I got rid of all my sharp furniture. I bought a bed for you with a pink comforter because Linda told me pink is your favorite color. I set up a space by the window where you can draw and do homework." Sophia was listening now, even though she was trying to hide it. "And I bought a piano," Margaret continued. "A real one, a good one. It's being delivered tomorrow." Sophia turned to look at her fully. "Really?" "Really. I wanted you to have your own piano, one that's perfectly tuned and ready whenever you want to play." For a moment, Sophia's face lit up. Then it fell again. "But what if you change your mind?" What if the adoption doesn't work out? Margaret felt like someone had punched her in the stomach. Sophia, look at me. Sophia raised her eyes reluctantly. I am not going to change my mind, Margaret said firmly. I know it's taking a long time. I know you've been disappointed before, but I promise you I am not going anywhere. Adults always say that, Sophia whispered. My dad said he'd come back from his business trip. My grandmother said she wouldn't leave me. Everyone says they won't go away, but they always do. Margaret felt tears burning behind her eyes. This brave little girl had learned not to trust promises because the people who should have kept them had let her down. You're right, Margaret said quietly. Adults do say things they can't control. Your dad didn't plan to not come back. Your grandmother didn't want to leave you. Sometimes bad things happen that nobody can stop. Sophia's lip trembled. But this is different, Margaret continued. This isn't about accidents or sickness. This is about me choosing you every day, even when it's hard, even when people try to stop us. I choose you, Sophia. How do I know you mean it? Sophia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Margaret thought for a moment. Then she pulled out her phone and showed Sophia a photo. It was her living room, completely empty except for Sophia's new bed and the space for the piano. I got rid of everything, Margaret said. My expensive furniture, my perfect white couch, my glass tables, everything that made my apartment look like a magazine and feel like a museum. You know why? Sophia shook her head. Because I want my home to feel like a place where a little girl can be happy, where you can spill juice on the furniture and draw pictures on the walls and play piano as loud as you want. I want it to be your home, not just a place you visit. Sophia stared at the photo. You really got rid of everything? Everything that mattered to the old me. Because you matter more. Sophia was quiet for a long moment. Then she asked, what if I'm not a good daughter? What if I mess up or make you angry? Margaret's heart broke completely. Oh, sweetheart, you don't have to be perfect. You just have to be yourself. That's all I want. Just Sophia. Even when I'm sad sometimes? Especially when you're sad. That's when families are most important. Sophia looked at the piano keys. I've been scared to play. Because what if you hear me and decide I'm not as good as you thought? Margaret understood now. Sophia had been protecting the thing that brought them together, afraid that if she wasn't perfect, Margaret would leave. Sophia, I didn't fall in love with your piano playing, Margaret said gently. I fell in love with you. The girl who waited 3 years for someone to ask. The girl who kept her grandmother's promise. The girl who was brave enough to trust a stranger. Sophia's eyes filled with tears. I want to come home with you. I want that too. More than anything I've ever wanted in my whole life. Sophia reached out and touched one piano key. The note rang out clear and true. Then she looked at Margaret and smiled. The first real smile Margaret had seen from her in weeks. Will you stay while I play? Sophia asked. I'll stay as long as you want me to, Margaret said. That's what mothers do. Sophia began to play. 8 months later, Margaret stood in the back of Roosevelt Elementary School's auditorium, her hands shaking with nerves. The spring talent show was about to begin, and Sophia was performing third on the program. Margaret had never been this nervous about anything in her entire life, including her first board presentation. Mom, you're pacing, Sophia said, appearing beside her with a gentle smile. Even after 3 months of living together, Margaret's heart still skipped when Sophia called her mom. Sorry, sweetheart. I'm just excited for you, Margaret said, though they both knew she was terrified. Sophia looked beautiful in her new navy blue dress with tiny piano keys printed on the fabric. Margaret had found it online after searching for hours. These days, she put the same energy into finding the perfect dress for Sophia that she used to put into closing million-dollar deals. Remember what we practiced, Sophia said, reaching up to fix Margaret's collar. It was funny how Sophia had become the calm one while Margaret fell apart over small things like school performances and parent-teacher conferences. Margaret laughed. "I think you're supposed to be the nervous one here." "I'm not nervous," Sophia said simply. "You'll be watching, that makes me brave." Margaret felt her eyes water. Even after all these months, Sophia could say things that completely undid her. Margaret had spent 42 years building walls around her heart, and this 12-year-old girl had knocked them all down with a few simple words. The first 2 acts went by in a blur. A boy juggling tennis balls, twin sisters doing a dance, routine to a pop song. Margaret barely saw any of it. She kept thinking about the journey that had brought them to this moment. The adoption had finally been finalized 2 weeks ago. Margaret still remembered walking out of the courthouse with Sophia's hand in hers, both of them carrying copies of the official papers that made them a real family. Sophia had insisted on stopping for ice cream to celebrate, even though it was 10 in the morning. "Now introducing Sophia Chen playing Chopin's Minute Waltz," the announcer said. Margaret's breath caught. Sophia had decided to take Margaret's last name, saying she wanted them to match. The first time Margaret heard someone call her Sophia Chen, she had cried in the grocery store checkout line. Sophia walked onto the stage with perfect posture and quiet confidence. She had grown 2 inches since Margaret first met her, and she carried herself differently now. Less like a girl trying to disappear, and more like someone who knew she belonged somewhere. The piano on stage was a beautiful baby grand that the school had borrowed for the evening. Nothing like the old beaten-up instrument where Sophia first played for Margaret. But Margaret knew that Sophia could make any piano sing. Sophia sat down at the bench and adjusted her position carefully. She looked out into the audience, found Margaret's face, and smiled. Then she placed her hands on the keys and began to play. The first notes filled the auditorium like liquid gold. Margaret had heard Sophia play this piece hundreds of times now in their living room, but it sounded different tonight. Richer, more confident. Sophia was no longer playing to prove she was worthy of love. She was playing because she loved the music itself. Margaret watched her daughter's face as she played. Sophia's eyes were closed, her whole body moving with the rhythm. She looked peaceful and joyful, and completely at home. This was who Sophia was meant to be. This was the girl who had been hiding inside all those months of silence and fear. The audience was completely still. Margaret could see other parents leaning forward in their seats, captivated by the music. A few people had tears in their eyes. Sophia had that effect on people. She could touch hearts with her music in a way that Margaret had never imagined possible. As the piece built to its climactic section, Margaret felt her own heart racing. Sophia's hands were flying across the keys now, the melody spinning and dancing with impossible grace. Every note was perfect. Every phrase told a story. But Margaret wasn't just hearing the music. She was remembering everything that had brought them to this moment. The first day they met, when Sophia was afraid to hope. The weeks of paperwork and interviews and challenges. The night Sophia woke up crying from a nightmare about being sent back to the children's home. The morning Sophia made Margaret breakfast, in bed, and burned the toast, but was so proud that Margaret ate every bite. The morning Sophia called her mom for the first time, casually, while asking for help with homework. The way Margaret had to excuse herself to cry in the bathroom, because no word had ever sounded so beautiful. The music was reaching its conclusion now. Sophia's hands moved with the kind of confidence that only came from feeling truly safe. She wasn't holding anything back. She wasn't afraid of being too much or not enough. She was simply, completely herself. The final chord rang out pure and strong, echoing through the auditorium before fading into perfect silence. For a moment, nobody moved. Then the audience erupted in applause. Margaret found herself cheering and crying at the same time, not caring who saw her fall apart with pride and love. Sophia stood up and took a small bow, then immediately looked for Margaret in the crowd. When their eyes met, Sophia's face broke into the biggest smile Margaret had ever seen. Pure joy, pure love. The smile of a girl who knew exactly where she belonged. After the show, other parents came up to Margaret to compliment Sophia's performance. Margaret beamed and thanked them, feeling like she might burst with happiness. She had never understood why parents talked about their children so much. Now she wanted to tell everyone about Sophia's talent, her kindness, her courage. On the drive, home. Sophia was unusually quiet. Margaret glanced at her in the rearview mirror. "Everything okay, sweetheart? You were absolutely amazing up there." Sophia was staring out the window at the city lights streaming by. "I was thinking about Grandma," she said softly. "I think she would have liked hearing me play tonight." Margaret's heart squeezed. Sophia still missed her grandmother terribly, especially during big moments like this. "I think she was listening," Margaret said gently. "And I think she's proud of how well you've kept your promise to keep playing." "Do you think she would like you?" Sophia asked. Margaret had to pull over because her eyes were too blurry to drive safely. "Why do you ask that?" "Because I think she sent you to me," Sophia said matter-of-factly. "She always said the right person would find me when I was ready, and you found me exactly when I needed you most." Margaret turned around to look at her daughter. "I think I needed you too, more than I knew." Sophia unbuckled her seatbelt and leaned forward to hug Margaret from behind. "I love you, Mom. I love you too, baby girl. So much it scares me sometimes." They sat there for a while, holding each other in the quiet car. Margaret thought about the woman she used to be. Successful but empty, respected but alone. She thought she had everything she wanted. She had been so wrong. Now she had Sophia's laughter filling their apartment, Sophia's artwork covering the refrigerator, Sophia's music floating through their home every evening, Sophia's hand in hers every morning as they walked to school. She had a daughter who made her coffee taste better, and sunsets look more beautiful, and ordinary Tuesday afternoons feel like celebrations. She had found her family in the most unexpected place, with the most unexpected person, in the most unexpected way. And it was perfect.